Hey everybody, welcome back. This is a coronavirus history lesson with Mr. Arvites. We're in U.S. history. We're talking about the Japanese buildup going into Pearl Harbor. So let's start off with the basics. Already, we've seen the French fall to the Nazis. We've seen the British put on their heels, right, in the Battle of London. And the United States is trying to take a backseat to all of these things. But really, the threat the U.S. government was really thinking about is Japan. They're not even thinking about Nazi Germany in that capacity. So how does all this start? Well, a lot of it's going to deal with the Japanese and trade, okay? But before that, we also have to understand the Japanese had an alliance with the Germans and with the Italians. This Axis agreement, right, was a military alliance. And so once war happens with one, it's going to happen with all. And everyone is kind of aware of that. Some people argue that FDR might know about Pearl Harbor in advance. Throughout this video, we're kind of dispel that. FDR does not know Pearl Harbor is going to happen. There are half-truths into all of these things. There are intelligence reports that an attack will happen. None that truly say Pearl Harbor. None of them really say the date of when it's going to actually occur. So as we go forward, we'll kind of look at that all together. So what is the United States' participation thus far in World War II? Well, next to nothing. We're doing the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act was the lending of money and weapons and materials to the British and then eventually the Russians as the Germans invaded the Russians. You know, Great Britain, we're going to lend off over $31 billion in military aid. The Soviet Union will receive over $11 billion in military aid. Most of this will never be paid back, to be honest. But we do this to become that arsenal of democracy. And there's a great document that you can look at from the World War II Museum that'll be on, if you're in my class, on my class site. But I do highly recommend you kind of go check out their World War II classroom. It's really good stuff, really good materials if you're interested in this. But either way, you know, the arsenal of democracy, this idea that they can supply the democratic fighting abroad against fascism is the only real entrance we have. We do have kind of the beginnings of the wartime economy developing. We also have the first ever peacetime draft in the United States. You know, we're trying to build up our army to where it's over 1 million soldiers. But this is a slow but sure process. It's not going to be done by 1941 and won't be done by December 7th, 1941. Now, the United States, in terms of its relations with Japan, was kind of a, up and down relationship. At times, we had a real positive relationship with Japan. In the 1930s, we did a lot of joint military exercises. As far as trade goes, we traded them a lot of steel, we traded them a lot of oil. A lot of the ships that they're going to use in Pearl Harbor are made from U.S. steel companies. And so a lot of those natural materials that they need, those natural resources to make these war machines are going to be done using U.S. products originally. Now, as the war with China, right, Japan and China rages on from 1937 onward, the United States is going to scale back how much we trade with the Japanese. And in fact, we're going to see a complete reduction. And then when the Japanese begin to attack British assets abroad and French assets abroad, the United States is going to start to decline on steel trade and oil trade, and eventually ending both in mid-1941. The other thing that the United States will do going into the end of 1941 is they will freeze Japanese assets in the United States. This is an economic measure that prevents Japanese citizens from investing in the United States, and it really is going to be one of the trigger points for the start of or the eventuality of World War II for the United States. Now, the other big factor is in 1940, Hideki Tojo is going to be named the Prime Minister of Japan. And Hideki Tojo is a warmonger in a lot of ways. He's going to be looked at as the guy who plans out Pearl Harbor, or at least the guy who orders it. And he's going to be at the end of the war kind of looked at as the Japanese foil. He gets convicted of a lot of war crimes that the Japanese committed throughout the entire war. He's not necessarily the guy who ordered all of these things, but it is his doctrine, his military expansionism that's going to fuel the Japanese war machine in the years to come throughout this. Now, Tojo, the reason he really wants to knock the U.S. out is they want U.S. assets in the Asian Pacific. What I want you to erase from your mind, and I always see these types of things on the internet, particularly from old people on Facebook, and they'll have things like, well, the Japanese never invaded the continental U.S. because between every house there was a gun and every American could have fought. And no, the Japanese didn't care about that. Like, be very honest with yourself. First off, the Japanese couldn't conquer China at the time. And so they were still engaged in a massive war, a guerrilla war in China. They had no desire to go 5,000 miles, 6,000 miles in the other direction and fight at the United States. They simply didn't have the capacity to go to war in a land operation in the Western U.S. Now, there is some truth to those statements because we do have Yamamoto, Yamamoto, right? Admiral Yamamoto is going to actually visit the U.S. Isoroku Yamamoto is going to go to the U.S. He goes to Harvard for a little bit. He visits D.C. He visits Annapolis. He traveled across the country via train, via railroad. So he saw large portions of this country. And so Yamamoto understood that the United States was so vast, an incredibly large geographic place. He also understood a little bit about the history because he did get to study some of these things at the U.S. colleges. And he understood that the United States was not a country that would simply just yield to the Japanese after a show of force. And Yamamoto, when Tojo is planning Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto is the most cautious of the Japanese leaders. And he does caution him. And he says, look, you need to be patient. You can't just go to war. You have to make sure we can get a knockout blow. And that's what Pearl Harbor is for the Japanese. They believe this is a knockout blow where they can knock the U.S. out of the war altogether. And that's ultimately what they're going to try and do. Now, we'll talk in a little bit about why it did not do that. So the United States, how are we handling all of this? Well, the United States is also dealing with an uptick in war efforts for Japan because we've begun to actively plan what a war would look like with the Japanese. We've put more and more soldiers into the Philippine Islands, into Guam. And so we're kind of loading up on those Asian Pacific bases. The other thing that the United States is doing is we're doing a lot of counter spying. And in fact, we cracked at least a portion of the Japanese code by mid-1941. And the Japanese will never figure out that we have their code cracked, but we'll have a substantial amount of it completely cracked throughout most of the war. And so as we crack their code, we start to get little bits and pieces of information, and that code cracking is going to be instrumentally important. And while no one believes the code talkers when they start predicting a Japanese attack in late 1941, early 1942, they will believe them in 1942 in May, when they, May and June, when they predict various battles, including Midway. And so these code talkers are going to be instrumental. When we talk about the Battle of Midway and Coral Sea, we'll talk about how Midway exclusively, you could argue, is going to be won by these code translators who are going to get the Japanese code and translate it and figure out what the attack is, when the attack's going to happen, and everything else like that. So let's move on to actual Pearl Harbor. So the actual Pearl Harbor event is kind of interesting in a lot of ways because Yamamoto believes that this needs to be a knockout blow. And there's always that old adage where he kind of predicts that if they don't knock the U.S. out with Pearl Harbor, this is going to be a 9-month war for the Japanese, then followed by the United States rebounding for the next couple of years until the resources that the U.S. has will just completely overwhelm the Japanese. And that's one of the things that he is afraid of. He knew the United States, if they weren't knocked out, had a number of resources available that could eventually just wipe out the Japanese war effort. And so that's his big fear. Now, what they need are all the aircraft carriers to be at Pearl Harbor. Now, December 7th, this is a leave day for the Navy. So the Navy is actually basically on holiday on December 7th. And when these planes start to fly over the island of Oahu at 7 a.m., there weren't a lot of people on the ready. A lot of people were just waking up, brushing their teeth. And these young guys, look, these sailors, when you read about them, they're 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. These guys are thinking about everything that young men think about. They're thinking about where they're going to go give breakfast. They're thinking about what they're going to do that night. There might be a dance going on later that evening. And so they're thinking about all the different social things that might be occurring. What they're not thinking about are that planes are going to bomb them. And the U.S. did have radar towers all around Pearl Harbor, but when they did see this on the radar, they didn't think anything of it. They thought more of like a flock of birds. And so it was largely ignored. There's also some submarines that get sighted and everything else. So the warnings are there, but the U.S. military is grossly unprepared for this. And so one thing I will say, look, Pearl Harbor as an event it has been chronicled a million times. And the movie Pearl Harbor is by far the worst chronicling of it. Honestly, you could get a 6-year-old drawing in stick figures and probably do a better job than that movie actually did. It's just that awful. And eventually I'll post an entire video to just point out everything that's wrong with that movie, but it's just horrible. It's probably why I have an irrational hatred of Ben Affleck, but that's okay. As Pearl Harbor begins, right, 375 Japanese planes are going to fly over the island of Oahu at 7 a.m. Now, what they're going to do, they have practiced this. So that they practiced this run in a fake port that they built off the coast of China. And what they did is they kind of they mapped out and they built, shadow images of the U.S. ships. And the pilots studied these images. So they knew exactly what ship they were going to do. Every one of those 375 planes has an objective, and they're all going to go to those objectives in unison. The other thing that made Pearl Harbor kind of remarkable is the Japanese went radio silent for a week going into it. And so as the ships and the aircraft carriers carriers left, the Japanese waters, they did not communicate via radio. They communicated in flag signals and various other means, but we had no idea where they were. And that was the first indication that these things were going to happen. Now, as those 375 planes fly over, the first round of planes aren't going to go after ships, okay? They're going to go after the airfields. And the U.S. had all of the planes in rows. It was beautiful, a beautiful sight for the Japanese pilots, and they bombed and blew up most of our planes. We only get a couple of planes in the air. Again, the movie Pearl Harbor makes it seem like we get a lot more, and it makes it seem like the struggle is way more even than it actually is, and it's really not, okay? It's just really just a one-sided affair. Yes, we do fight back. Yes, we do put up a fight in a struggle, but it is completely one-sided. Now, when the airfields are destroyed, the rest of the planes are going to go bomb the actual harbor itself, including the ships, except there's one thing missing. None of our aircraft carriers are there. Our aircraft carriers, for varying different reasons, one of them was simply just lost in a storm, another one went the opposite way for port, were not at Pearl. And so because of that, our aircraft carriers will not be hit. And because of that, you could argue the entire war is going to be saved going forward. Now, what actually happens? Well, as the planes begin to drop, the Japanese are going to sink 18 U.S. ships. They're going to kill 2,400 people. The most famous ship that was sunk was the USS Arizona, and the Arizona had 1,177 sailors on board when it went down, and it's a truly tragic event. You can go visit it at Pearl Harbor today. If you want, it's a really kind of a mesmerizing experience. But the thing about the Arizona, it's one of many ships, right? These battleships get sunk. The Oklahoma has great stories about the Oklahoma, because the Oklahoma turns upside down, right? Capsizes, and you have people just struggling tooth and nail to survive in the Oklahoma, because the water begins to rise up, and they're trying to, bang on the ceilings, trying to get people to get them out. And there's going to be welders trying to get there, and it's a race against time to get these guys out throughout the day of December 7th. And you have people who get sucked through these little areas of the ship and never seen again, and it's a really traumatic experience. The other thing that the Japanese hit were the military bases all along there. They do destroy a number of equipment throughout that, and Pearl Harbor is in a lot of ways a devastating blow to the U.S. Navy, and it is ultimately probably the largest failure of intelligence that we had in that time period. Some would say ever, but definitely up there. It's a complete lack of intelligence is one of the reasons why it's so successful for the Japanese and why it was so kind of just out there. Now, as the U.S. hears about this, right? First off, most Americans couldn't tell you where Hawaii was. But now all of a sudden they were enraged that Americans were attacked on Hawaii. And FDR, of course, gives that speech, right? December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. And he highlights that the Empire of Japan deliberately attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, the thing about that speech that is so amazing, and I highly recommend you Google it and listen to it or watch it on YouTube. If you're in my class, I'm going to put it on our little Teams account, so you'll be able to listen to it. That speech is extremely powerful because FDR isn't just going to outline Pearl Harbor, but it's a whole host of other events that happened. On December 8th, we're talking about Guam getting hit, Wake Island getting hit. We're talking about the Philippine Islands getting attacked. We're talking about Indochina getting attacked. The Japanese attack every major Allied holding in the East Pacific by December 10th, essentially. And so these massive attacks, this is a well planned out, well orchestrated event. And FDR says in that speech, they were deceived by this and that the Japanese ambassador had made no notions that war would happen. That's sort of true, sort of not true. There have been lots of hints from the Japanese ambassador that war could happen. And in fact, he did have a declaration of war and he was waiting. And as FDR finds out, Japanese ambassador gives him the declaration of war. And so, did FDR know about this? I'm going to say no, he does not. FDR does not sacrifice 2,000 American lives so that we can get into World War II. He's not aware. Now, he does know the Japanese are going to attack, and this does make his job of getting us into the war a lot easier. And you could argue that this is ultimately going to be the big thing. But I've seen conspiracy theories that argue that this is how the Depression ends and the New Deal wasn't working. That's what FDR did. No, the Depression was more or less over by this point in time. Keep that in mind. If anything, we were in a minor recession by 1941. The military had already started to boost production, and so these things have already ended. Now, FDR is going to respond with a declaration of war on the Japanese. The Germans will respond a couple of days later by December 11th with a declaration of war on the Americans, as will the Italians, okay? And FDR in his speech says something that I think is remarkable. He says, we will not stop until absolute victory, right? And absolute victory is an essential. okay? Because we're not going to have a negotiated peace. This is going to be a war of annihilation in a lot of ways. And we're going to talk about that as we get further into the war in the Pacific, because more so than the Atlantic theater, this is going to be a war of annihilation, ultimately culminating in the dropping of the nuclear bombs. But to show you exactly how big Pearl Harbor also was, they attacked every major U.S. installation in the Pacific, okay? And so a couple of the places that are attacked. Wake Island. Wake Island is a fascinating event because Wake Island's a small little island, less than a mile and a half, wide. It's essentially a fuel depot, a little stop for ships along the way going across the ocean. It's a moon shape, so it makes a wake. Okay. Wake Island is attacked, and there are 450 U.S. Marines defending it. And they're going to hold that island, right? They're going to hold that island for basically 15 days. They're going to hold it for 2 weeks against the Japanese. And they're going to be attacked by more than 800 Japanese, or well over 800. They kill 800 Japanese soldiers attacking the island. They're going to be attacked by thousands. And eventually they do surrender on December 23rd because they are completely surrounded, and the U.S. government says, we cannot bail you out. We cannot save you on this. And so Wake Island goes from December 8th to the 23rd. Now, the thing about Wake Island is reports start coming back of this. It becomes like the Alamo of the Pacific. And so you have Remember Wake Island. These posters come up and people begin to enlist in the Navy, enlist in the Marines. I'm going to remember Wake Island. I'm going to do that. And so while Wake Island is a loss, in a lot of ways, it becomes a propaganda win, much like the evacuation of Dunkirk for the British. They lose, but they kind of have this story they can tell. And Wake Island is that. Unfortunately for the POWs from Wake Island, 120 Marines died in the actual battle, but we're going to see another 150 or so die in captivity. And the Japanese treated prisoners of war extremely cruel, and that's going to be another reason why this war takes such harsh elements to it. Now, the Japanese also attacked Guam on December 8th. Guam is a U.S. military holding, again, purchased in the Spanish-American War, or obtained in the Spanish-American War. And the battle for Guam only lasts for 2 days. Just about every U.S. plane on Guam was destroyed within the first 12 hours of fighting. Most of the tanks were destroyed, and most of them were destroyed because they were just lined up and ready to go. And we only really have about 17 Marines and sailors die on Guam, and there's a complete surrender. It's one of the largest failures of the U.S. military at the time, not nearly as highly reported on as Wake Island. Wake Island got all the press. Guam was kind of just overlooked. December 8th, Japan also attacked the Philippine Islands. Douglas MacArthur and his Philippine forces were unprepared. They lose 95% of their aircraft in the first 48 hours of fighting. Most of them are lost in the first minutes of fighting because they're, again, are just, on the tarmac, right? They're just there. And so the aircraft are going to be destroyed. Now, the Philippines is going to be a much longer campaign. The Japanese are going to fight from December until March of 1942 to take the Philippine Islands. The Philippines represent numerous problems for the Japanese military, but ultimately the Americans cannot get reinforcements, and the American and Filipino forces are going to be pushed back across the island throughout those 3 months. Douglas MacArthur is going to stay with his soldiers and fight tooth and nail with them. We'll talk a lot about egos in World War II, and Douglas MacArthur is probably one of the biggest egos in World War II. And of course, he makes his famous statement as he leaves that he vows to return. He will take back the Philippine Islands. And of course, that's going to lead to the 1944-45 campaign to take back the Philippine Islands, which we could argue was completely unneeded in the entire war effort. But MacArthur is going to do that anyway. Now, MacArthur, while he gets all the glory and all the press clippings and gets a Congressional Medal of Honor, his men suffer tremendously. 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers are captured by the Japanese. They're going to be divided up into groups of 1,000 and marched 60 miles through the Philippines to various railroad hubs where they'll then be shipped off and then marched to POW camps. Along these marches, around 10,000 people died. So 1 out of every 7 of the people in those marches died during those marches. In the next 4 years of imprisonment, we're talking around 15 to 20,000 people died in those imprisonments. It's hard to get a tell because we don't know quite how many Filipinos are in that as well. And the stories from that are absolutely gruesome, right? During the marches, if people fell behind because they were wounded, they would get shot on the side of the road or beheaded in front of their soldiers. And so the stories that soldiers tell from the Bataan Death March are absolutely tragic. And the Japanese actually make a lot of these things well known, that prisoners are going to be mistreated. And that's going to be part of the reason why this becomes a war of annihilation. It's not about revenge, but for American soldiers, it's about if you're captured, you're probably going to die, or at least that's the thought process, and so they're not going to do it. And for the Japanese, they already had that ingrained, and we talked about that through the education and the cultural parts of the Japanese. Now, as we look at the map, right, and there's a map right here, look at it, that map is going to show you the Japanese holdings, and this map comes from the National World War II Museum, so give them a lot of credit. This map shows you the Japanese holdings after all of this, and they conquer a huge sphere of influence in the Asian Pacific, and that is going to be what the U.S. has to go against. And when you factor that into the Nazi occupation of Europe, it doesn't look good for the U.S. But as we know, and that's what we'll talk about in the next run, is the home front's really going to gear up and get production rolling, and we're going to outproduce everyone in the war and then eventually outfight everyone in the war. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Until next time, Mr. Arvites.